Hi guys, today we're going to be talking about the stretch reflex. Now, an example is shown in this diagram and it's called the knee-jerk reflex. And I'm sure many of you will have experienced this reflex either when you've gone to the doctors or in class or even in your university studies like I have. Now, this is an important reaction which causes the extension of the lower leg, and it pretty much results through the contraction of what we call the quadriceps femoris muscle, which is shown in the diagram on the anterior leg. Now, what happens in our muscle fibers, in all our muscle fibers, we have what we call muscle spindles, and these are particularly important in detecting changes in length. And this happens through special stretch receptors which do detect this change in length. Now, these muscle fibers, these muscle spindles, are innervated by gamma motor neurons, which modify the sensitivity of the muscle spindle, either increasing or decreasing its sensitivity. So what happens when our tendon is struck by a small hammer, as seen in this diagram? Well, our muscle spindle detects a change in length that results from the tendon being struck with the hammer. If this surpasses a threshold in the stretch receptors, as we know from our cell sciences, that an action potential is fired down a nerve. These nerves being the primary sensory neurons of our peripheral nervous system. And in this case, it's a primary afferent neuron. These primary afferent fibers, as we see in the diagram indicated by the blue and green, the bluey green sort of fiber, travel towards the dorsal root ganglion and into the dorsal horn of our spinal cord. As we can see in the diagram, this then branches off into three separate areas, and those three areas are the ones that I'm going to talk about today separately. Now, when we think about a stretch reflex response, we generally think about the primary response. The primary response being that initiates the contraction of our quadriceps muscle and causes the extension of our lower leg. Now, in this primary response, we can see in the diagram is indicated by the primary afferent fiber branching off that is on the very left of the diagram, the one that travels down. Now what happens, as we can see in this diagram, the primary afferent fiber travels to the ventral horn where it synapses directly with what we call an alpha motor efferent neuron. Now we can remember that it's called an efferent neuron because this efferent motor neuron will be exiting from the central nervous system. So the easy way to remember it is because it starts with E, so does exit. So it exits and it's an efferent motor neuron. Now we call this a monosynaptic junction because the primary fiber synapses directly with the motor neuron, which will then go back to our antagonist muscle to stimulate contraction. And thus it's a monosynaptic reaction because it directly joins. Now this alpha motor neuron, this efferent neuron, exits via the ventral root, which we can see in the diagram here, this red solid line being our alpha motor neuron, and travels back to the muscle from which the stretch was detected. In the case of the knee-jerk reflex, this is the quadriceps femoris muscle. This innervates the quadriceps femoris muscle, causing contraction of the muscle and thus causing extension of the lower leg. Alright, so that's the primary sort of response that we see in the contraction of the quadriceps muscle in the knee-jerk reaction. As we can see, the primary afferent fiber, the primary sensory neurons, also called the primary afferent fibers, does branch off in the spinal cord. This is what we call the inhibitory response. Now, in our brain, about 50% of the neurons are inhibitory neurons, as when you think about it, it's pretty much as important for a muscle to contract, also for the brain to be able to control it not contracting or inhibiting its contraction. Now, what happens in the central nervous system is what we see a reaction, a synapsing between the primary afferent fiber and an interneuron. We call this an inhibitory interneuron. Now this inhibitory interneuron travels between the dorsal and ventral horns where it again synapses with a completely different alpha motor neuron. This alpha motor neuron is not similar to the one that attaches and innervates the quadriceps femoris. Alternatively, it actually innervates the antagonist muscle, which we see in this diagram is the hamstring muscle. Now as we can see, this synapsing between two different at two different points is why we refer to the inhibitory response as a polysynaptic response. Okay, so we have our interneuron which reacts with our alpha motor efferent neuron. Now what happens is this interneuron releases inhibitory neurotransmitters which hyperpolarize the membrane potential of a polysynaptic cell. In general terms, what this means is that it increases the threshold of the cell, preventing the antagonist muscle from firing. So it pretty much prevents the hamstring muscle from contracting, allowing for optimal contraction of our agonist muscle, that being the quadriceps femoris muscle. Okay, alright, so now we've seen what happens in a primary and an inhibitory response as part of our stretch reflex. Now, as we can see, the primary afferent fiber does branch off again. And as we can see in the diagram, this travels back up the central nervous system towards the brain. Now, this is important because it allows for the brain to recognize that this reflex action has taken place. So that when you get hit in the knee, your brain recognizes that, oh, look, my leg has extended, and thus is purely for recognition terms and for further processing. Alrighty guys, I hope you understand the differences between sort of the primary and the inhibitory responses in the stretch receptor. In general terms, we call the stretch reflex a monosynaptic reflex, purely because in the primary response we see a monosynapsing directly between our primary afferent fibers and our alpha motor neurons. So when you write this down in an exam, remember that it is a monosynaptic response, that in our inhibitory pathway the interneuron releases inhibitory neurotransmitters, causing the prevention of the antagonist muscle, in this case the hamstring muscle, from firing, and that there also is a fiber which travels towards the brain that allows us for recognition that this has taken place. Alrighty guys, I'll be chucking up a few more little videos of some more explanations of stuff, but hopefully this gives you a little overview of how things work. And yeah, so study and enjoy. Cheers.